of the stuff you don't see, but also the public engagement that is provided and let people kind of get a sense for, where we are in the universe, which is pretty insignificant if you consider, those images. I think it's been a great success, and it was a great first mission for me.
Watch afterwards tonight at 9 Eastern on Book TV on C-SPAN 2.
Up next on the presidency, we hear about George Washington's diary from a trip to Barbados in 1751, which gives a detailed account of his only journey outside of colonial America. A young bachelor traveling with his brother Lawrence, he survived a serious case of smallpox while on the island, an experience with later implications during the Revolutionary War. Karl Watson, who serves on the board of directors for the George Washington House in Barbados, spoke about this chapter of Washington's life at a symposium on the places where the first president lived and visited. Recorded at Washington's Mount Vernon, Virginia home, this is just under an hour.
Well, folks, my name is Ed Ryan. I'm a member of the Lifeguard Society here at Mount Vernon. In September of 1751, George Washington boarded a ship with his brother Lawrence and traveled to Barbados, arriving on the 2nd of November. As he traveled to Barbados, he kept a detailed diary which survives and is at the Library of Congress. In partnership with the University of Virginia Press, Mount Vernon will release a new fully annotated edition of this journal in February of 2018, which readers will find to be an excellent example of professional editing and brimming with insights into a lost world. Since 1968, the Mount Vernon Ladies Association has been a leading supporter of efforts to transcribe and annotate all the papers of George Washington. With the opening of the library in 2013, the Ladies Association increased its support of more scholarship around the life and legacy of George Washington. This included support for the Washington Family Papers, an effort to transcribe and annotate the papers of Martha Washington, as well as George Washington's parents, near relations, including Bushrod Washington, the inheritor of Mount Vernon. This complete transcription of the Barbados Diary represents the first publication in the Washington Family Papers project. And now I'd like to introduce our next speaker, Dr. Karl Watson. Dr. Watson is a senior lecturer in the Department of History at the University of the West Indies and is also deputy chairman of the board of directors for the George Washington House Restoration Committee in Barbados. Dr. Watson is the author of titles such as Barbados, the Civilized Island, Barbados, A Social History, 1750 to 1816, and Barbados First, The Years of Change, 1920 to 1970. He's editor of the Journal of the Barbados Museum, and finally, Dr. Watson is an honorary secretary for the Barbados National Trust. His lecture this afternoon is titled Hospitality, and the Genteel Behavior is Shown to Every Gentleman Stranger, George Washington's Impressions of Barbados and Barbadians in 1751. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Karl Watson.
Good afternoon, everyone. And I want to begin by saying what an honor and a pleasure it is for me to have been invited by Mr. Stephen MacLeod to speak to you this afternoon. And I particularly want to single out Mr. Anthony King, who's been most gracious and helpful to me in everything. It's the first time I've been to Mount Vernon. I'm here with my sister Hazel. And it's been a wonderful learning experience, having experienced all these wonderful presentations, and moreover, meeting so many of you all over yesterday and today. You all have been very gracious and very welcoming to me, and I am really honored, as I said, to be here. Now, I'm going to be speaking to you this afternoon about young George Washington in Barbados, and what I will attempt to do is, using his journal that he kept while he was on the island, I'm going to attempt to recreate what he saw on the island, what he commented on, and perhaps to some degree what he did not comment on, because sometimes what we choose not to comment on can be just as revealing as what we actually comment on. So, armed with my trusty pointer, which hopefully will work. Yes, it does. He was a young man. From today's perspective, young people, we don't expect great things of them. I think we tend to mollycoddle the young today. But in the 18th century, a man just short of his 20th birthday was a man. And as you've heard from previous presentations, he was in many respects quite experienced. At 16, going off into the wilderness surveying. He was no neophyte. So 4 months shy of his 20th birthday, he accompanied his ailing brother Lawrence to Barbados, where they hoped that Lawrence would be cured of his tuberculosis. And as I mentioned, he kept a journal during this first and only ever overseas visit. The journal has survived. It's in the Library of Congress. You can actually download it and read it. It's in bad condition, and some of the pages are missing, unfortunately. But it does provide wonderful insights into the mind of this young man, revealing him to be a self-confident, observant individual with an inquiring, analytical mind. Why Barbados? Why did they choose our island? Well, tiny and perhaps insignificant as it may seem today, Barbados from the 17th on to the middle of the 18th century was really one of the, if not the prized possession in the British Empire. Sugar and rum had made Barbados very wealthy. A resident plantocracy ensured a well-developed infrastructure on the island. Furthermore, there were skilled doctors on the island, which held out some hope for Lawrence's recovery. Dr. Hillary, who had achieved some eminence in England, had transferred his practice to Barbados, and Lawrence was one of his patients. The Washingtons, furthermore, had friends and relatives on the island, which guaranteed them some degree of support. It's incredible when one thinks of the actual relationships, and people move to and fro, and sometimes families might have a cousin well placed in one of the British North American colonies, or vice versa. So distant relatives of the Washingtons were in Barbados, the Balls, the Rumballs, the Parketers. And interestingly enough, I actually found in one of the old levy books for Bridgetown for the precise period that the Washingtons were in Barbados, the middle of the 18th century, there was, and I presume he must have been a very distant relative, there was a George Washington who lived in Cheapside in Bridgetown. And then, of course, there were the in-laws, the family connections. Lawrence's wife was a Fairfax. And the second wife of William Fairfax, who himself had served for some time in Barbados, was Deborah Clark, who was sister to Gedney Clark of Barbados. So the Washingtons then were well set up to, went for a bit too much, to be accommodated on the island. Now, the mantra of real estate is location, location, location. And Barbados, right there, is very well located. It's in the crossroads of the North Atlantic economic system. So, South America, Africa, North America, Europe, United Kingdom. Barbados in the 17th century was actually one of the hubs of the English, ultimately the British Empire's trading system. Boston in North America, London in the home country, and Bridgetown in Barbados. So, again, very important in terms of the logistical, navigational, and trading aspects. An importance, again, far belying the size of the island. And if we look, again, here at the West Indies, Barbados, and a little aside to illustrate the importance of these islands. It seems incredible today, but at the end of the 7 Years' War, France was prepared to give up half of the continent of North America in order to retain these islands of Martinique and Guadeloupe. You see, the French probably argued that sugar and rum were far more important than snow and beaver pelts. So they gave up Canada in order to keep, as I said, Martinique and Guadeloupe. This is from the Mall 1717 map of Barbados, and it shows Barbados as a mature sugar colony. Already one of the world's most densely populated places, every name that you see on that map represents a sugar plantation. And the island itself, I mean, quite remarkable. There were over 700 functioning sugar plantations, in addition to over 2,000 what were called places, which were like 7, 8, and 10 acre lots. Now, of course, a large plantation on the island really didn't exceed 200 acres. If you were really, really wealthy, you owned 300 acres. But land was frightfully expensive in Barbados, and with 200 acres, you were guaranteed a pretty good livelihood. This is a page from young Washington's journal. You can see part of the problems with it here. It's been eaten away there, and there are actually several pages that you only have a section available now. And I'm really looking forward to, as was mentioned, the republication of George Washington's journal. I was fortunate to have acquired this copy done by Toner. It was given as a Christmas gift in 1892, and it came on the market, and my book dealer managed to acquire it for me. There's nothing better than, going to the young man's original thoughts and reading them. So he kept a log after they set sail on the, what we think, not absolutely certain, but we think the success, which sailed from the Chesapeake, leaving what would be the United States of America the 19th of September, and arriving in Barbados the 2nd of November, 1751. But he mentions here you can see it there, the dolphin. He said, we caught a dolphin. And this was, in his words, a dolphin we catched at noon. And he had a ship's cook dress it. And dolphin, of course, I played George Washington in the theatrical dinner with George that we do at the George Washington House in Barbados. And when I say, we always have dolphin on the menu, and when I tell people that we're going to have dolphin, they cringe and they say, oh no, we're not going to eat flipper. And I have to remind them. But dolphin is, of course, this is a species of fish, as opposed to the mammal that we know and love. Another fish that young George would have eaten large quantities of in Barbados was the staple of Barbados, which continues to be the staple of Barbados today. It was caught in such great quantities in the 18th century that this was actually called the Barbados pigeon. or Spike's pigeon. But it's a fish that actually glides to escape the predators. Very tasty. If you ever go to Barbados, you should, of course, indulge in what is part of our national dish. So, this is their first view of Bridgetown. Now, unfortunately, the page in his journal that would have commented and established his initial impressions and what they saw as the ship sailed into Carlisle Bay, etc. Sadly, that page is missing. Someone may have torn it out and given it to somebody. Mice may have eaten it. We have absolutely no idea what happened to it. But this is a view of Bridgetown. It's a lithograph printed in the 1750 Griffith Hughes edition, Natural History of Barbados. So it's pretty much what George would have seen, or interestingly enough, was slightly earlier done by the New England artist Copan, which again shows the nature of Bridgetown, and more importantly, underscoring the role of Bridgetown and Barbados as a hub in the North Atlantic trading system, the large amount of shipping in Carlisle Bay. And this wonderful painting that was found in the attic of one of the country homes in Britain, it shows Governor Robinson on his way to church, painted somewhere around 1740. Again, a huge amount of shipping in the bay. And over here, St. Michael's and All Angels Cathedral, where George and Lawrence, during their stay in Barbados, worshipped. An Anglican church, or as you say in the States, an Episcopalian church. And this is what he saw, Carlisle Bay today. Well, you can imagine this. First of all, tropical light is different to temperate light. Artists who paint in the temperate countries find it very difficult to adjust to tropical light. So he would have seen this, of course, whoops. This is where initially they would have stayed, and up here in the back is the house he eventually rented. So you can imagine, as a young man, he may have swum early in the morning here, or he had a choice of a wonderful beach on that side. Doing my little bit for tourism for Barbados, you see. I have Petra in the audience. So, again from his journal, we pitched on the house of Captain Crofton. Now, the footprint of this house, and it's been authenticated by rigorous research, the footprint of the house is what the Washingtons would have rented. But in 1790 it was acquired by the British military, and what they did was they raised the roof line. So the house that the Washingtons would have rented would have been a floor and a half with dormer windows on this side, and not as elaborate an entrance. And archaeology has shown that the original roof was either a tiled roof or a slate roof, but we used shingles in the restoration. This property was scheduled for demolition, and it was really the visit of President and Mrs. Clinton to Barbados that saved this property, because it was owned by the Light and Power Company, and they were on the point of demolishing it to put up a modern office block. So thank goodness for President Clinton, who visited at an appropriate time. There was a bit of earlier confusion, because just down the hill there's another house which was built about 10 years after the Washingtons visited Barbados, and somebody in the towards the end of the 19th century, a gentleman called Mr. Parvicino decided that he would get Americans to come off the ships and visit by advertising this house incorrectly, erroneously, as the George Washington House. I was asked by your government and the government of Barbados to escort Mrs. Clinton, who came to visit. And I met her at the entrance before we'd restored it, and we waited and chatted, and 10 minutes went by, and I said, my gosh, I'm keeping the First Lady of the United States waiting. That's very impolite of me. And I said, well, Mrs. Clinton, shall we start? And she said, oh no, let's wait on the foreign press to come. I want good coverage for Barbados. And we waited another 10 minutes, and eventually the bus turned up with everybody on board, and they'd been taken to the wrong house. But thank goodness, Mrs. Clinton, as I said, was very gracious in waiting. So, again, from George's diary, he commented on the hospitality and genteel behaviour of the Barbadians. They had a very busy social life in Barbados. For the 6 weeks that George was there, he only ate in that house on 3 occasions, because Barbadians fell fond over the Washingtons, and he was invited to dinner. He could have eaten in 10 different houses every single night. They frequently attended dinner parties, and more importantly, they met members of the resident plant elite of the island, as well as military officers, merchants, and visiting British officials. That, for a young man from Virginia, meeting this wide cross-section of important individuals in the British Empire, I think, made a great impression on him at the age of 19. Through their family connections with Gedney Clark and his wife, the Washingtons were invited to a local dining club called the Beefsteak and Tripe Club. And as he himself noted in his journal, whenever they went, they received invitations from every gentleman there. He was lucky. I think for the first time in his life, he attended the Guy Fawkes celebrations. I suspect everybody in here knows the story of Guy Fawkes, who plotted to blow up the House of Parliament, was captured, executed, and since then, in November, Guy Fawkes is celebrated with fireworks, etc. So he was invited by the clerks to see the serpents or squibs fired. They instructed both Lawrence and George to bring their guns with them. So we know from that they travelled with guns from Virginia to Barbados. He also made his first recorded visit to the theatre to see the play, The Tragedy of George Barnwell. Again, quoting him, the character of Barnwell and several others was said to be well performed. There was music adapted and regularly conducted by a mister, and that's where there's a flaw in the original journal, so we have no idea who conducted this group. It was a London troupe. The Tragedy of George Barnwell was the hit on the London stage of the time, and after, of course, they exhausted themselves in London, they came out to Barbados and presented this play. A very sort of turgid sort of drama. Young George Barnwell is an apprentice, and he falls in love with the daughter of the merchant he's apprenticed to, and then he's seduced by an older woman who leads him down a path of theft and murder and mayhem. So as he's on his way to the gallows, the young merchant's daughter comes up to him and confesses her love, and just before he's hanged, he goes into this long address to the audience saying, don't do what I've done, stay on the straight and narrow, don't follow that pathway of sin and perdition. These are some of the individuals he met on the island. the Maynards, this is their surviving sugar plantation on the island. He would ride out. They'd start early in the morning because Lawrence complained about the hot tropical sun. Oh, well, you can imagine, Lawrence was very ill with the TB that he had. But they were also invited frequently to the Warrens' residence, which still stands, a house built in 1660, now offices for an offshore company. So they were royally treated on the island. He enthused about the beauty of Barbados. He wrote, "There's several regular risings in this island, one above each other, so that scarcely any part is deprived of a beautiful prospect, both of sea and land. And what is contrary to the observation on other countries is that each rising is better than the other below." And Lawrence very tersely agreed, saying, "This island is the finest in the West Indies." And this is what he meant by risings, because, of course, Barbados is a coral island that emerged in the late Pleistocene. And you have these series of coral cliffs. As the tectonic plates met together and the island rose and rose from the sea, you get inland cliffs of the same type. So these were the risings that young George Washington referred to. And as you go inland, and you find these folded ancient sea cliffs, but quite picturesque. He was always looking out for agricultural prospects, and he made this comment: "The earth in most parts is extremely rich and as black as our richest marsh mold." And this is a field being prepared, young sugar cane, and being ploughed for planting cane as well. And he didn't ride apparently over the entire island. At least there's some notification of that in his diary. But he did extensively ride out in the southern part of the island. And he was on the island at the right time to see the sugarcane maturing. It's harvested in the dry season, and it flowers cane arrows which flower. So you can see this is a modern photograph of Barbados. But the thing about the island that he met, the sugar revolution in the 17th century had completely clear-cut the island. And the planters deliberately set out to create a huge garden over the entire island. And this is what George Washington saw. He, given the worldview of the time, the planters had created, and very full of hyperbole. You read their letters, their statements, etc. Barbados had become this demi-Eden, the fairest of the Western Isles, a garden of paradise on earth. And George went along with this. He also commented on the population and the nature of society that he met with. He said, of the white population, there are few who may be called middling people. They're either very rich or very poor. This lady, I knew her, she passed away last year. She's actually the great aunt of our songstress, Rihanna. Rihanna's father descended from indentured servants who had been brought to Barbados in the 17th century. Of course, during the Cromwell period, over 10,000 Irish were sent to Barbados. And then West Country, after the Monmouth Uprising, Judge Jeffreys exiled a lot of West Country people to Barbados, which is, if you listen to my accent, you'll see that I pronounce my vowels quite broadly. And if you go to Somerset, Devon, you will notice that they too pronounce their vowels very broadly. And interestingly enough, among the poor whites of Barbados, there is the curse of royalty. They're all bleeders, and that is a genetic flaw that again can be traced to the area of Somerset that these exiled people were exiled to Barbados. But society that Washington met, it was a slave society. Barbados, when the Washingtons arrived there, had a population of about 80,000 people. Approximately 16,000 were white and 64,000 of African descent. But by the middle of the 18th century, the Barbadian population was already relatively old. They had been on the island for several generations. The Barbadians that he met would have been 4th, 5th, and 6th generation born. My family, for example, went to Barbados in 1627. So we've been on the island almost 400 years. And what I'm saying about the age of the population also applies to the black Barbadian population. Because Barbados was an experimentation by the English in slavery. And early on, just as many women were brought as men. Unlike what happened with the later West Indian Islands, as the sugar frontier expanded, men then tended to be brought in larger quantities. So there was a gender imbalance in the population. Barbados was different. The gender balance was the norm from a very early period. So by the time the Washingtons arrived, the slave trade was unimportant for the island. And when the agitation to end the slave trade, which ended in 1805, began, the Barbados House of Assembly instructed their agent in London not to do anything to prevent the passage of the act abolishing the slave trade because it was in the economic interest. They didn't do it for moral reasons, they did it for economic reasons and for the self-interest of Barbados. Demerara, Trinidad, were now being newly colonized, and the Barbadian planters were terrified that their island would be swamped by this new virgin land and new production elsewhere. So this is a painting by the Italian painter Brunius, and it shows the 3 tiers of slave society. In the West Indies, it was sort of like a sliding scale between white and black, depending on the admixture. So all the old terms were used: mulatto, quadroon, quinteroon, etc. Brunius was a very keen observer of West Indian society. And slave life. Again, Washington doesn't talk much, or hardly at all, about the slaves he encountered. I suppose it was because he himself was born into a system of slavery in Virginia. He himself, at the age of 10, had inherited 11 slaves. So he was very aware of the system that operated. This is an interesting late 18th century collage showing amusements, music, dwelling quarters, and the work done by the slave gangs working in the slave fields, in the cane fields. I don't know, late 19th century photograph showing exactly what Washington would have seen: women operating sugar mill. There were 500 of these sugar mills in operation in Barbados. It was quite remarkable, the use of wind power to grind the sugar cane. So the cane would be reaped, fed in through there's an area in the mill that you'd feed the cane through. It would be ground, and then the juice passed to the boiling house, and that whole process of making sugar and molasses and ultimately rum. There were members of the free colored population who were in that intermediate group. They were free, yet their civil rights were enormously constrained. A free colored individual could not give evidence in a court of law against a white individual, and other aspects of life that were constrained. When the Washingtons rented the house, he himself complained. He said, "We pay this extravagant amount of £15 a month, and it doesn't even include washing." So to do their washing, they would have had to have hired what we call the jobbing slave. And perhaps if you had a misfortune to be a slave, being a jobbing slave was the best of the worst. Because you were semi-independent, you contracted with your owner to pay a certain portion of the monies that you earned from working. You didn't live under their control. At the end of a week, you went and paid your owner whatever sum of money, and once everything was agreed upon, you went back to your own little private world. And this is Kitty Cox, again, an actual woman. This was a watercolour done about 1790. So, what is it about the enslaved population, the vast majority, huge majority on the island, and why are they largely absent from George Washington's case? There are only two references that appear in his journal. He says, the ladies generally, meaning the white ladies generally are very agreeable, but by ill custom affect the Negro style. What does that mean? It means that George observes, without commenting on it, the creolization process, which manifests itself in language, cuisine, dress, etc. Essentially, what he's saying is that the whites of Barbados have gone native. And he must have been confronted with situations like this. You know, among ourselves, we code switch. We move from standard English, or an approximation of the Queen's English, to what we call Bajan, which is a Creole form of English. So George could very well have been in a situation where one of the young ladies he met could have been talking to him quite nicely, and then wanting to get some for George would sort of like turn her head and switch immediately and say, "Quashabaloka, come here, let me tell you something. Karasana, guava cheese, and bring for massage right now, boy." And you can imagine George's eyes probably dropped open at this. My God, what is this woman speaking? Is this a foreign language? And so I suspect, because in the statement, by ill custom affect the Negro style, he's being critical. He's not being supportive. He thinks in a way that the Barbadian whites are letting down the side. At least that's my interpretation of what he's written here. The other aspect is, of course, the food stuff. Again, he was so observant and so keyed in to aspects of agriculture that he saw everything, and he wrote it all down in his journal. So he noticed that guinea corn, which is a type of sorghum or millet, he said here, this greatly supports the Negroes. That was one of the typical foods used. And in fact, today, we make a dish called conky, which derives from a West African culinary process, which uses guinea corn as one of its major components. How did creolization occur? And of course, generations of young whites had been brought up by black nannies who acted then as both transmitters and receivers of culture. Because remember, culture is not biological, and culture is a two-way street. I discussed a little bit of this with my friends in the archaeology lab here, and they said, to some degree, a similar thing happened in Virginia, but far more muted than the process that was underway in Barbados and the other islands of the Caribbean. And one of my favorite cartoons, because in the late 18th century, white West Indians were attacked. This cartoon says, Kwashiba, there's a white woman upstairs looking out through the window. And in reality, she's calling down to the slave at the doorway, Kwashiba, I'm tired. Come and take in my head. It was an 18th century caricature that essentially was saying that West Indian whites had become sort of, even in mature life, still retain infantile aspects by being mollycoddled in a slave society where slaves could obey their every whim and every order. So slavery was an institution that warped and changed the enslaved, but also warped and changed the mind of the enslaver. Again, a two-way street. And I think young George Washington was keen enough and astute enough to pick that up. He also was a very keen observer of the military fortifications of Barbados. He said, and I quote, "They have large entrenchments cast up wherever it's possible for an enemy to land, and may not, as nature has greatly assisted, improperly be said to be one entire fortification." Then he also noted, "The militia is well disciplined and appointed to their several stations, so that upon an alarm, every man is at his post in less than 2 hours." And remember, the Caribbean is the theatre of war in the contest for world supremacy between Britain and France in the 18th century. And the key logistical point in the Caribbean is Barbados, because it had never been invaded. Mother Nature, as George Washington pointed out, protected the island. So this is a French spy under the guise of being a Jesuit priest who came to Barbados, and he surreptitiously did a crude map of the island, pointing out all the fortifications on the island. And here is the fort that George Washington knew very well, Charles Fort, where he dined on many an occasion. And this is Charles Fort today, which juts out from the peninsula where the Hilton Hotel is. He dined with Captain Petrie on many an occasion, and on one occasion he seemed to have been developing an eye for the ladies from an early age. He went to a dinner party here, and it was just him and ladies in attendance. I think the ladies of Barbados, this young, virile young Virginian, in a society where women outnumbered men, I think the women of Barbados were falling over themselves to see if they could capture this great prize from Virginia. Well, that didn't happen. He didn't marry and stay in Barbados. He came back to Virginia and married Martha. And of course, he was correct in his assessment that nature greatly assisted in protecting Barbados, because the entire east coast of Barbados is protected by these offline coral reefs, and an invading fleet could never approach from this side, which is why there were no forts built on the eastern side of Barbados, just on the west and southern coast of the island. Well, now one of the what-ifs of history, he noted, was strongly attacked by the smallpox, sent for Dr. Lanahan. Had George Washington died in Barbados, I think it is fair to argue that the subsequent history of the United States could well have changed its course. Who knows, there might not have been a revolution, or it might not have been successful. I don't think I'm going out onto a desperately thin limb and about to fall into an abyss. My view, my interpretation, George Washington, is that he was the glue that held the revolution together when there were disparate regional parts of what became the United States of America. And George Washington, with his consummate diplomacy, overcame all of that. So George didn't die, and more importantly, he acquired immunity. And this proved fortuitous, as during the course of the Revolutionary War, when smallpox broke out among his troops, he was protected from this dreaded illness, so common in the 18th century. Now, possible but medically debated consequence is that this bout of smallpox, with its attendant very high fever, may have caused infertility on his part. Martha was fertile, but George desperately wanted to have children of his own, but did not, and despite every consultation with the doctors of the time, there was nothing that could be done for him. So this is a reconstructed bedchamber in the George Washington House in Barbados, where theoretically poor George lay ailing, and Dr. Lanahan very conscientiously attended to him. Let me at this point thank Mount Vernon, thank Colonial Williamsburg, and thank many agencies, including American Express, for helping our island restore and create this interactive museum in honor of your first president. We were hoping to have a larger financial input from the US government that had been promised to us, but unfortunately 9/11 intervened, and that put paid to all our plans, but the Barbadian taxpayer footed the large amount of the bill to the tune of $7 million for the restoration. There was a little bit of niggling complaints by a few people who said, why are we spending $7 million of the taxpayers' money to celebrate the life of a Virginian slave owner when we could buy 3 new dialysis units for the hospital and build a new school for children? But the vast majority of Barbadians were very supportive of this initiative. You know, sugar is a dying phenomenon on our island, and we gain our livelihood largely through tourism. And this was a very important feature. For those of you who are observant, you can see, however we try, we cannot mimic the paint of the 18th century. So because this building is made of coral stone, not brick or any other type of material, but coral stone hewn from the dead fossilized coral reef, it absorbs water. It absorbs water, and every year we used to repaint, but we simply couldn't financially manage that. It just simply cost too much money, so we'll probably now repaint every 5 years instead of every year. But anybody who visits says, why is this? Why does it look so? And we have to explain the problems of nature that we encounter. On Sunday the 22nd, he took his leave of his brother, a very bittersweet moment for him, weighed anchor, and got out of Carlisle Bay about 12 noon. So ended his 6-week sojourn on Barbados. It was a learning experience which had exposed the young Virginian to a level of society he had not previously encountered, to a well-developed sugar island, which was one of the trading, military, and logistical hubs of the British Empire, to a new form of intensive agriculture. He even noted they're very careful in saving, which I think was an adaptation that he ultimately brought to Mount Vernon with him. Jack Warren, who is one of the historians of Washington, argues forcefully that Washington's visit to Barbados was a turning point in his life. This is our national flower, the pride of Barbados. I discovered recently, in reading a book on the gardens of Mount Vernon, that in later life, George Washington asked the ship's captain to bring back some young plants of the pride of Barbados, and he planted them in his greenhouse. And I like to think Because, you know, as all of us, as we grow older, we become introspective. And we like to go back to the days of our youth. And on a cold winter's night, he must have thought of that tropical island that he experienced, the only place he'd visited outside of Colonial, USA. And I think he must have looked back with a little bit of perhaps nostalgia at his time there. As I said, a bittersweet moment, because despite the administrations of Dr. Hillary, Lawrence could not be cured, and he came back to Virginia and died. But I can imagine General Washington, President Washington, sitting here in his parlor, perhaps on a cold night, thinking back on his youth, and with a glass of good old Barbados rum, because he drank rum, with a glass of good old Barbados rum, getting warm on that cold night. You know, my understanding is that in his first inauguration as president, when his aide said he should be toasted in wine, he said he wanted to be toasted in rum. And I'm assuming, of course, that that was good old Barbados rum. Thank you all very, very much.
We have time for 2 quick questions.
How was Barbados affected by the American Revolution?
That is an interesting question. Well, I'll start by telling you that there was political division in the island because a great many people wanted to join the revolt in British North American colonies, and we would have become an offshore state and become part of the United States of America. And it's amazing the language that they use, because these are slave owners, but yet they're inflammatory languages. They don't want to be enslaved by the nefarious tax regime of Great Britain. In expansion, because it's a very important point, and I'm glad you asked that question. Excuse me. In 1651, Barbados declared itself independent of England. 1651, Cromwell sent out a fleet and besieged the island, and eventually the island surrendered. But in the Charter of Barbados, which were the Articles of Surrender, Clause 3 was a very important clause, because that was the first time a colonial entity expressed the view that there shall be no taxation without representation. And I like to think that in one of the many meetings of the Besaken Tribe Club, there were discussions on this point. Young George would have met Scotsmen, Stevenson and company, who were anti-monarchical, who were Republicans. And I'm sure they had that sort of discussion. And I don't think it's an accident that quite a number of the signatories to the American Declaration of Independence were of Barbadian origin. The Carolinas were settled by the Corporation of Barbadian Gentlemen Adventurers. First 5 governors of South Carolina were all of Barbadian origin. And the links and the connections are really incredible. Here in your state, the name Lee, Robert E. Lee, his father, Harry Lighthorse Lee. Those Lees, leaving England, went to Barbados, and after a generation or 2, made their way up to Virginia. Richmond, Virginia, was laid out by the famous William Mayo, who was a cartographer on Barbados. And my family, we perhaps could have ended up differently, because one of my mother's ancestors came to Alexandria, and in 1790 tried to set up a business there. It didn't work, so he went down to Barbados, and history changed. I am here, and so is my sister. So, yes, but the reason why Barbados did not end up by joining the United States was we faced reality. The power of the Royal Navy. Because we were an island, and we'd already been subjugated and invaded by Cromwell's forces, we knew that would have been our fate. What the Philadelphians said, They excoriated Barbadians. They said we were cowards.
And we have to break at this point. Thank you.
Thank you.
Up next on the presidency, textile historian Natalie Larson describes how various beds owned by George Washington at his Mount Vernon home or on the battlefield reflected his social standing and wealth. In the 18th century, beds were a luxury item, but even the wealthiest Americans had to contend with various discomforts, including bed bugs. This talk was part of a Mount Vernon symposium exploring the various places where Washington lived or visited. It's 45 minutes.
Good afternoon. My name is Adam Irby, and I'm Associate Curator here at George Washington's Mount Vernon. Today it is my pleasure to introduce an individual whose work you have all seen, but whose name you might not recognize, Natalie Larson. Natalie is the unsung hero of American house museums, and of Mount Vernon in particular. She is responsible for authentically recreating all of the beds, curtains, and household textiles that make Mount Vernon believable as a home. Natalie is widely recognized as the leading American expert on furnishing textiles of the 18th and 19th centuries, and is the sole proprietor of Historic Textiles Incorporated of Williamsburg, Virginia. She began her career as an archaeologist, deeply interested in understanding the ways people lived in the past and how they lived with and express themselves through their material possessions. Over the past 30 years, Natalie has taken that approach above ground by studying and documenting surviving furnishing textiles in order to recreate them for use in historic house museums. She began her career as an archaeological draftsman at Colonial Williamsburg before becoming their historic furnishing specialist. While at Williamsburg, Natalie refurnished nearly every exhibition building, including the most recent restorations of the Peyton Randolph House and Governor's Palace. Since leaving Williamsburg, Natalie has worked for more than 80 museums and public sites, as diverse as the Museum of Fine Arts Boston, the Virginia State Capitol, and Melrose Plantation in Natchez, Mississippi. And she is the go-to textile expert for what I consider the three most important houses in America: Mount Vernon, Monticello, and the White House. On a more personal note, Natalie is an extraordinary mentor to curators around the country, including myself. She selflessly provides insights from her years of study and serves as a thoughtful sounding board on museum furnishing and interpretation. But before I leave the podium, I would like to introduce you to Natalie's latest project for Mount Vernon, the Blue Bed Chamber. Over the past year, Natalie has recreated George and Martha Washington's long-lost blue bed from scratch in consultation with my colleague Amanda Isaac. Using Washington's 1759 invoice and replicating bits and pieces from surviving beds of the period, Natalie carefully assembled the parts to make a bed that we are confident the Washingtons would recognize. I think we can all agree that the result is nothing short of spectacular. In the past week, Natalie confided to me that one of her career goals is to see all of the mansion bed chambers restored. So far, she has recreated 4 beds for us, but there are still 3 left to go. In the coming years, we hope to make Natalie's vision a reality, and I hope you keep this lecture and Natalie's extraordinary work in mind as we seek support for these projects. So, without further ado, ladies and gentlemen, Natalie Larson.
I think we're going to have to put Adam on the family payroll, Bruce. Gosh, I aspire to live up to maybe half of that. First, I want to thank Adam Irby for helping me the past couple weeks pull a lot of the slides that Mount Vernon has in their archives, which was no small task. I think I emailed him about 10 times asking for just one more. Also want to thank Amanda Isaac, who let me read her account book report here on file. Also to Susan Scholler, who has a deep and abiding interest in all things textile. And Carol Cadieux, now vice president, but then curator when I first came here a few years ago, for first giving me a tour of the mansion and America's favorite house. So the study of furnishing textiles is important to historians because it provides a window into the world of how